This video is going to walk you through all the steps involved in the Woolies. First, we'll start with unpacking your kit. So when you receive your kit, first things first, you want to take everything out of the bag. So in the little pouch inside, you'll find 3 large tapestry needles. In the pocket at the back, you'll find a poster. Then you'll find an instruction booklet. There's the canvas which you'll be stitching upon. All the wool in pre-cut stitching lengths. And finally in the front pocket, you'll find a wool colour guide. I'm showing everything here for the kit Calypso. This applies to all the Woolies. We'll come on to the wool and mounting the canvas shortly, but for the time being, we're just going to quickly talk through the different booklets. So the poster shows you a full detailed image of the piece you're going to stitch. This is in here as it's a really useful reference when you're trying to work out stitching lengths or directions, and you can refer to close to see how I did it. Secondly, we've got an instruction booklet, which on the back has detailed steps through everything to do, and on the inside contains a guide showing you stitching directions. The main thing to be aware of with this is the stitching direction. So here I'm just going to show you how to mount up your canvas onto an embroidery frame. You don't have to use a frame when stitching this piece. However, it is a really useful thing to do to make sure you maintain tension. First, you'll need to trim down your canvas to fit the frame. If you've ordered a frame from us, this is just a little bit smaller than the length of the canvas, as you don't need to have such a large amount of edging on the canvas. You see I've removed all the clips from the frame, and I'm now going to just attach the edges of the frame into the clips. The clips have a little ridge which fits into the ridge within the hole. And what I want to do is make sure when I'm attaching these clips that I'm attaching the frame in a way where it's straight. I'll show you this close up in a minute. You don't need to have much of the canvas within the clip, just 1/2 centimetre or something on the opposite side. So you can see here close to, there's a little ridge in the wooden frame, and the clip has a little ridge in that fits into there. So what you do is you position your canvas onto the frame and then you clip the clip in place. So it's going into the ridge. You get quicker at doing this, so just take your time to begin with. Then I'm going to push the frames into the 2 end pieces, so it all clips into space. And then here I have separately all the bolts needed. So you see I have a little washer, goes on one side with the wing nut, and I'm going to tighten it. You might find it easiest here to use what is known as an LBZ Twizzler, which just makes it really easy to tighten and loosen the wing nuts. Once you've got it tightened, just loosen them very slightly and you start twisting your frame in. You see I'm twisting the canvas and pulling it in till it's tight. And with that on there, I'm ready now just to sort through my different wool colours. So you have a colour guide which aligns to the colours written down the side of the canvas. So first things what I do is just go through and get yourself familiarised with which colour goes where. In the instruction booklet, we've included on the back a little guide of which colours make up the border, the sky, etc. So for example here, we'd say that colour 1 is the border. It's useful just to go through and make sure you're happy with which colour's which before you get started, because this will make it much easier as you stitch. So you can see I've now put my wools all in the same order. And I'm just going through which wools go where. You'd repeat this exact same process with any other woolly. So now I'm going to just show you a bit of getting started stitching. And here I'm going to start with the border. What you can do is you can refer here to the picture, having a look and seeing which direction the stitches go. So you can see that on this edge, side edge, they're going horizontally. And this all aligns to the plan in here, which shows that the light grey stitches should be horizontal. So the vast majority of border, sky and sea in Calypso, for example, is horizontal. For your wool, you're going to stitch this all using 2 strands of wool. Now we've cut them into quite long lengths, and here you have the choice of either doubling over a single strand, or what I'm going to show you here is that I'm going to stitch the entire thing with 2 very long strands. Why I like to do that is because it means I've got to strand up my needle less. You'll find with the long stitch you cover ground quite quickly, so the less you have to restrand the needle, the easier. But if you find that these lengths are a bit too long for you to manage, then by all means cut them in half. All I've done there is just tied a knot in the end, and I'm now going to start stitching in my long stitch. Again, I'm going to want this to be going horizontally. You see I've got a little diagonal on the top, but I'll show you that shortly. One thing to bear in mind is that the guide that's printed can often be a bit ambiguous of which square it's on. Therefore, just pick a side and just work in that direction. So here you have a choice of working on either the outside or the inside of that stitch. It really doesn't matter where you choose for that stitch to go. So don't worry too much about how precisely you follow the guide. Also, because of the size of this canvas, you will find that the pattern may drift. This is because you're stitching onto a canvas here, and the cotton canvas is a natural fibre, and therefore there's always a bit of variability when they print on, which becomes, over the longer distance, can mean lines drift. Again, really don't worry about this. If your stitches end up moving across a row as you stitch, it does not matter. You will not notice in the finished piece. So when I'm doing my long stitch, you'll see here that I'm going to do a stitch from left to right. And just with the beginning, when I'm working with quite long pieces, I'm just easing the thread through slightly. So my first stitch is going to go across from left to right. And then my next one will go back from right to left. So if you've done any embroidery and you've done something like a satin stitch, you'll be used to working always going left to right. Here, this is different. This is the opposite, where each stitch will work one direction and then come back in the opposite direction. This is because there's a lot of rigidity in the canvas and you don't need to have more volume on the reverse side. So all our volume is on the front of the piece. It's key that you do stitch in this style, as the kit contains enough wool for you to be able to stitch, always with all the stitches being on the surface. If you end up having your stitches so that you've got a lot of stitching on the back of the canvas as well, you may run out of wool. And so I'll stitch this section here and then I'll show you how the back looks, so you can make sure that your reverse looks the same. So you see here on the reverse, there's no stitching on the back and there's only little stitches on the edges because each stitch is going across the front. Now I'll just show you stitching in the diagonal corner. As I showed you, the stitching switches direction from the side rows to the top row. So here, all I'm going to do is just stitch across a diagonal, and I'm not worrying about how neat this is because it's just about getting the general diagonal. It doesn't have to be really methodical, and that's the beauty of these woolies, is you're trying to have a piece that feels naive, and anything that's too perfect actually can lose a lot of that naivety. So imperfection is perfection. So once I'm up in this top edge, I'm now just going to switch my stitching direction so you can see the difference when I start stitching vertically. And it's basically exactly the same, but all I'm doing is working it over a vertical. And in a couple of the woolly kits, you'll see that you also have a diagonal stitch involved. And again, this just means you stitch in any diagonal. Don't worry about the diagonal being too precise. We're just working in a different direction. So this is, as you can see here, I'm now going to be doing this on the vertical. And you can again refer to the picture and you'll be able to see those stitching directions. You can see here I'm just connecting up the two diagonals. So do remember that stitches go into the same holes as each other. So in the end, you can end up having 4 strands coming out of the same hole in the canvas. You'll see this later on when I show you a bit more of my stitching on the actual central section of the ship itself. So here I'm just going to show you a bit where I'm stitching into the central bit, and here I'm using less methodical stitches. So the key when you're stitching the sky, when you're stitching the sea, or various pieces of your woolly, is to vary the lengths of the stitches. This is more in line with the very traditional wool works. You want each stitch to start and finish in different places, and so it really creates that volume. I mean, you're using still the 2 strands throughout, but that also has a way of creating the texture we need. But you see my stitches here range from anything from about sort of 3 stitches to 15 stitches. So I can cover quite long distances. Now, if you're not stitching it on a frame, do just be careful when you're doing these long stitches that you don't pull the canvas in too tight, because you want to make sure you don't over tighten the canvas and then you can't stretch it out after. You see, I'm working my needle into holes where my previous stitches ended, and I'm, like we did on the border, always going each stitch in the opposing direction, and I'm trying to minimize how much wool I use on the back of the canvas. So each stitch starts near where the last stitch finished. And you're going to use either one of these 2 approaches throughout the piece. So either stitching in this varying way, or when it comes to certain elements like the sails, you see I've got those going in very long single stitches. For the little single stitches, such as the red lines across the sails on Calypso, and you'll find it in certain parts of the sea, in Nautilus for example. You'll sometimes be doing single stitches just from over one hole only. But you see how simple this is. All we're doing is we're always using, just varying the direction of the stitches, but using very long stitches. So you'll actually find you end up stitching your piece up fully quite quickly. Don't worry too much about how precise you are to parts of the colour guide. The beauty of the Woolies is you want to create that sense of variety, you want to create unevenness, because that's what makes it feel authentic. So the one bit which isn't printed onto the canvas is adding all our ropes in. Now at this point again, do refer to the printed pictures you've got, the posters in the kits, because they'll show you all the places that I've added ropes in. And all I'm using is I'm using the dark colour indicated, which will be written into your instruction booklet, and I'm adding big long stitches over the top. The key thing here is don't over tense the fabric when you're doing this. So ideally work on a big flat surface, and so you don't pull the fabric in too tight. You absolutely do not have to do the stitches where I've done them. This is all about adding, there's lots of ropes in and creating that real sense of character, that sense of texture. You can see here the whole reverse of the piece, and I'm just sealing off every single thread under the reverse of the fabric. I'd be doing that throughout, so all my threads have always just been tied off on the reverse of the fabric, running the needle under a couple of strands. I'm going to keep showing you this stitching in the ropes for a while, just because I think this is the bit where you're most having to be independent on how you're stitching this, because nothing's printed on. Again, you can see me finishing off the thread, running it under the back there. And I'll just show you a bit on a different woolly, so you can see how I'm taking the exact same approach here, for example with Nautilus. So the final bit of stitching I'm going to show you, we're going in quite a lot of detail here, is on stitching ladders. And so to stitch the ladder, what you're first going to do is you're going to lay in the single straight lines of the overall ladder shape. And then you see What I'm doing when I create the ladder is I need to lock it to the various points, so I have to stitch through to the back of the canvas at various points along the way. So I'll show you this a few times in detail so you can see how I'm going back and forth. It's the way that I am able to keep the lines of the ladder separate. So you see here, I'm just doing a little stitch over the top of the line through to the back of the canvas. Then I'm going to draw part of the ladder, one of the rungs of the ladder going across. And then I again just secure that bit there in place. So I put a little stitch on to open out the strands. I'll do this at the odd point all the way down, so maybe once an inch, I'll put a little securing stitch in place. And then I'll go back and between each securing stitch, add in extra rungs where I don't need to hold the threads down. There you can see me adding in extra rungs between where I don't need to put these securing stitches in place because the strands are already being held apart by the stitch that I previously had in. I'm going to show you this again now on Nautilus, and I just want to make sure you really get lots of evidence of how I stitch these, so we'll show you this in quite a lot of detail. So you see here how the ladder's all been secured out, and then I'm adding in extra steps, extra rungs over the top of where I've previously secured it to separate it. It will pull in as you go, but that all adds to the quirky, weird, whimsical charm of it. Now do refer again to the printed poster, which will show you a lot of the places I've added the ladders in on this. So the final step we're going to talk about is mounting your woolly. And this is the way I use to mount the piece. Now if you work with a good framer, you will just be able to take them your tapestry and they'll be able to do this step for you. What I'm using here is I've got a piece of foam board that's cut to size, and I'm using some pins. Now here I'm using hemline pins, but what I would recommend, and what we send out when we will send out our mounting kits, are tapestry pins, which basically are like a T-bar, and they help secure it in place. So all I'm doing is I'm pinning my canvas to the mounting board that's behind it. I'm going to pin from each corner first, and this just helps it to be secured, and then I'll work inwards. And basically what I'm doing here is each time I'm pulling it so the canvas has straight lines following along the top edge of the board. Because there's such clear lines on the canvas, you can quite easily see where it needs to be. Now again, like if you're using tapestry pins, this is much easier because the tapestry pin holds the canvas down with the T-bar. Here, when I'm using hemline pins, I'm having to push the hemline pin through the actual canvas rather than just the holes in the canvas. So it's a bit harder on your fingers, and you might want to use a thimble. It's always harder in the first bit when you're securing the corners, but once you've got those all secure, you'll find it much easier. You'll then be able to put this framed mounted woolly up into any different frame. The key extra final thing, you might want to somehow stitch across the back to hold the bits of the fabbed canvas tightly into the piece. I'll just show you here as I work round, stitching, pinning the whole side down, and you see how I pull it tight and I straighten it. And I'll continue working the whole round the piece until the entire piece is pinned. As you can see, I've got it pinned here. Now those pins just remain in the piece. The final bit I'll do is I'll just pull the back in. And so then you've got your finished woolly. I really hope you've enjoyed stitching this. If you have questions not answered by this video, do get in touch. And if you want to see closer up images of the woolies, take a look at the website.